In the humid summer of 1978, Pinebrook, a quiet rural town surrounded by dense forests, was jolted awake by a discovery that would haunt its legacy for decades. It started as a missing persons case. Amanda Delaney, a 17-year-old high school student, had gone out for an evening walk and never returned. At first, the town believed she had simply run away. Teenagers did that sometimes. But 3 days later, a hiker stumbled upon something strange in the woods just outside the town line. Beneath a layer of leaves and loose dirt, the smell of decay led him to Amanda's lifeless body. Her face was untouched, peaceful even, but her hands were bruised, and her clothing was torn. Whoever had done this had taken something. Her shoes were gone, and her backpack was missing. But strangest of all, a silver heart-shaped locket sat neatly on the mound of dirt beside her, perfectly polished, as if it had just been cleaned. The police rushed to the scene. They combed through the area, scanning for tire marks, footprints, or broken branches, anything that could point to a direction or clue. But the killer had been careful, disturbingly careful. The locket had no fingerprints. Amanda's body showed signs of being cleaned. Even the soil around her grave seemed undisturbed beyond the immediate burial. It was like the killer had walked in and vanished into thin air. The forensic technology of the time had limits. DNA analysis was a decade away from being usable. The only evidence they had was Amanda's lifeless body and that gleaming locket, which no one could explain. Amanda's parents held a vigil. The whole town attended. Candlelight flickered across tear-streaked faces, but deep down, everyone was afraid. This wasn't a random accident. Someone had done this deliberately, and they might be walking among them. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread. Some claimed they saw a strange car parked by the forest trail that night. Others swore Amanda had mentioned a man following her days before. But nothing solid ever came of it. The leads dried up. The police quietly filed the case away under unsolved. Life moved forward, though slower and more cautious. Just when the town began to catch its breath, 6 months later, another girl disappeared. This time from a neighboring county. Her body, too, was found in the woods. And again, beside her lay a piece of jewelry, this time a delicate gold ring. No prints, no motive, no trace of the killer. Only this haunting signature left behind. But back then, departments didn't share data the way they do now. The connection between Amanda's case and this second murder was never made. To Pinebrook, Amanda's death became a dark memory, a warning told in hushed tones at bedtime, a tragedy the town never forgot. But for the killer, it was just the beginning. He had killed, buried the evidence, and walked away untouched. Confident. Invisible. Ready to strike again. Nearly 5 decades later, the murder of Amanda Delaney had become a faded story, a footnote in the history of Pinebrook. Most people had moved on, and the case file sat untouched in a dusty storage room deep inside the State Cold Case Unit's archive. That changed when Claire Mitchell, a new forensic analyst with a quiet obsession for forgotten cases, stumbled upon a box that didn't belong where it was. The label was faded and misfiled under property theft, but when she opened it, she found photos of Amanda's burial site, autopsy notes, and a small plastic bag containing a silver locket. Something about it pulled at her curiosity. She read the report again and again, but what really caught her attention wasn't the crime itself, it was the eerie precision of it. The way the body was buried, the lack of physical evidence, and the pristine condition of the jewelry. It felt calculated, not random. Claire had seen patterns before. She knew when something was out of place. On a hunch, she began combing through cold cases in nearby counties from the late 70s and early 80s. That's when she found another girl, Sarah Jameson. Her case had been closed as a tragic unsolved homicide, nearly identical to Amanda's. A young woman, killed and buried in the woods, with a gold ring placed beside her body. The similarities were too strong to ignore. Claire kept digging and uncovered a third case, then a fourth. Different towns. Different jurisdictions. But the same type of victim, the same burial method, and always an item of jewelry left behind. She laid the cases side by side and realized no one had ever connected them. At the time, most law enforcement agencies operated independently. There were no centralized databases, and no one had thought to look at murders outside their own county. But Claire saw the trail. It was faint, buried under decades of dust and silence, but it was there. She created a map and placed pins where each victim was found. It formed a loose but traceable path, one that seemed to follow old highways and remote routes, places a person could easily pass through without being noticed. Among the documents in Amanda's file, Claire found something even more compelling, a fingerprint lifted from a silver locket. At the time, it had been considered unusable due to smudging, and fingerprint databases didn't exist. But now, with advanced technology and access to national records, the partial print could be run through the system. She scanned it, submitted it for processing, and waited. When the results came back, Claire felt her stomach tighten. The system had returned a match. The fingerprint belonged to Harold Jensen, an elderly man living in a quiet suburb not far from where the first murder took place. He had never been arrested, never even been questioned. On paper, he was a model citizen. But now, after 45 years, his name was attached to 9 bodies. The truth had finally caught up. Harold Jensen lived in a quiet brick house with trimmed hedges and a freshly painted mailbox. To neighbors, he was the retired postal worker who smiled politely, waved every morning, and sometimes helped carry groceries. He was the kind of man people didn't notice much, and that's exactly how he liked it. He had lived in the same house for over 30 years, paid his taxes on time, and had no known family. To the outside world, he was invisible in the most ordinary way. But when the fingerprint from the locket matched his name, everything changed. The cold case unit quickly built a file. Claire and her team dug into Jensen's past. He had worked for the U.S. Postal Service from 1969 to 1990, a job that took him across state lines regularly. He retired early due to medical reasons and had since lived quietly off his pension. Travel records showed he had been in or near each town where the murders took place. His addresses aligned disturbingly well with the map Claire had created. Each time a murder happened, Harold Jensen had been within 50 miles. With a warrant in hand, investigators arrived at his home early one morning. The house was clean, minimal, almost too perfect. But when they reached the attic, everything shifted. Behind a false wall hidden by insulation and old holiday decorations, they found a narrow crawlspace. Inside were 9 dusty shoeboxes, each one labeled with a year between 1978 and 1985. The contents were chilling, small items meticulously wrapped in cloth. Lockets, earrings, rings, bracelets, and a few scraps of clothing. Each item had a number marked in red ink on masking tape. Next to the boxes was an old road map pinned to a wooden board, filled with red dots that corresponded exactly to the victim locations. The air in the crawlspace was thick with the weight of the past. These weren't trophies collected by accident. They were tokens, reminders, proof that Harold Jensen had never forgotten. He had kept everything hidden in the same house where he mowed the lawn, fed the neighborhood cats, and lived quietly for decades. The team took photographs, bagged evidence, and swept the rest of the house. They found no weapons, no blood, nothing violent. Just silence and order. But Harold wasn't there. He had disappeared 3 days before the search, leaving behind only a handwritten note on his kitchen counter that said, "Gone fishing." That phrase set off alarms. Investigators scrambled to locate all nearby fishing lodges and cabins registered under his name or known aliases. Eventually, they found one, a small lodge he had visited every summer since the mid-1980s, located deep in the state forest, far from cell towers or major roads. They moved quickly. A team surrounded the area, not knowing if Harold would run or resist. But when they entered the cabin, he was sitting by the window, gazing out at the water, as if nothing at all was wrong. His fishing gear lay untouched beside him. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply looked over his shoulder and nodded, as though he'd been expecting them all along. Inside the cabin, Harold Jensen was calm, too calm. He sat in a wooden chair facing the lake, his hands resting lightly on his knees, as if he were simply enjoying the morning. The officers approached slowly, weapons drawn, but there was no need. He didn't move, didn't speak. When they placed the handcuffs on him, he offered no resistance, only a faint nod of acknowledgement. It was as if he had already accepted the outcome long before they arrived. Back at headquarters, Harold was booked and placed in a holding cell. His fingerprints matched the ones found on the locket from Amanda Delaney's case. The items recovered from his attic lined up with evidence from at least 9 other unsolved murders. The timeline was exact. The jewelry matched. The locations were consistent. The map alone was enough to implicate him, but the fingerprint had sealed it. Still, investigators hoped for a confession, some explanation, some insight into why. For 3 days, Harold said nothing. He sat quietly in the interrogation room, eyes distant, hands folded. He didn't respond to questions, didn't acknowledge photos of the victims, and didn't flinch when confronted with the evidence. His silence was chilling. It wasn't denial or fear. It was something else, acceptance, perhaps, or indifference. To the investigators, it felt as though he had already processed everything internally long ago, and now there was nothing left to say. On the 4th day, something shifted. Harold requested a pen and paper. They gave him a legal pad and a blue ink pen. He spent nearly 2 hours writing, his hands slow and deliberate, occasionally pausing to stare at the ceiling. When he was finished, he slid the pad across the table and leaned back in his chair. No words, no eye contact. Just the note. The contents were brief but devastating. In clear block letters, he listed the names of 9 women. Alongside each name, he wrote their age and the year they died. Each entry was followed by a single-word detail, ring, locket, bracelet, identifying what he had taken from each victim. At the bottom of the page, he wrote one final sentence, asterisk, I knew you'd catch up. Just not this late. Asterisk. There was no apology, no mention of motive. No details of how or why he chose them. Just names, dates, and possessions, as if documenting an inventory rather than lives lost. Prosecutors had more than enough for trial. The written confession, combined with the physical evidence, made the case airtight. For the families of the victims, it brought a strange kind of closure. The pain remained, but now there was a face, a name, a person to hold accountable. The media swarmed the story. A serial killer, hidden in plain sight for nearly half a century, unmasked by a forgotten fingerprint and a cold case analyst who refused to look away. But for Harold, it wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't even punishment. It was just the end of something he had started a long time ago and quietly waited to finish. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims filled every row, their faces etched with a mixture of sorrow, anger, and quiet determination. Some had flown in from other states just to see the man who had stolen their daughters, sisters, and friends. Reporters lined the hallway, their cameras flashing as Harold Jensen was led inside in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, face blank. He walked slowly, with the calmness of someone who had nothing left to lose. There were no outbursts, no breakdowns. Just silence. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprint on the silver locket. The shoeboxes of personal items. The hand-drawn map matching exact burial sites. And most damning of all, Harold's own handwritten confession listing each of the 9 victims. He didn't take the stand. He showed no reaction as prosecutors read aloud the names of the women he had killed. He stared straight ahead, unmoved, like a man watching the final chapter of a story he'd already written. The families gave impact statements. One mother described waking up every day for 40 years wondering if her daughter had suffered. Another father said he couldn't walk into a forest without thinking of the shallow grave his child had been left in. Some cried. Some spoke with shaking voices. Others simply stood in silence, their pain too heavy for words. Harold showed no emotion, no regret, no flicker of recognition. When the sentence was read, life in prison without parole, there was no applause, no cheers. Only the weight of justice landing after decades of waiting. For the families, it wasn't enough to erase the loss, but it was something. A final answer to the question that had haunted them for most of their lives. Harold was transferred to a maximum security prison, placed in a solitary cell. He never spoke to the press, never wrote another word. He became just another inmate, a man whose face now sat among the most notorious killers in state history. Guards described him as quiet and distant, polite but cold. He spent most of his time alone, reading old books or staring out the narrow window of his cell. In Pinebrook, the town where it all began, the story reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Amanda Delaney's grave became a gathering place, where people left flowers, notes, and candles. Her parents, now elderly, stood at her headstone in silence. For them, the arrest and trial hadn't brought peace, but it had brought truth. And truth, no matter how painful, was something they had been denied for too long. The legacy of Harold Jensen became a chilling reminder that evil can wear the face of the ordinary. That some monsters don't live in shadows, they walk among us, unnoticed, unremarkable, until it's far too late. But in the end, even after 45 years, the truth surfaced. Justice came. And though it moved slowly, it did not forget.